Welcome to Open Forum from the MTA USA studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. Today we discuss peace on earth. We discuss peace from a nice sentiment, a hippie phrase, peace on earth, to something, is it really attainable? Can there be actual peace on earth? We discussed this from the religious context. Can all religions come together? Can any religion bring the world together towards peace? And are there leaders out there who can do this better than others and who are working on peace on earth? And then, what is the formula for, from an Islamic point of view on peace? Because the consequences, if we can't achieve this, are scary. World War III could be imminent, and we'll be discussing this in the light of a couple of recent books that came out, and to emphasize on the part about how do we achieve peace and justice. With me today are some great panelists. First on my right is Amjad Khan, who's a practicing attorney in Los Angeles, as well as a National Secretary of Public Affairs for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
Next is Wasim Sayed, who is from Los Angeles area as well, another Californian.
Don't hold that against me.
We'll not, because I'm a Californian as well, and he's the National Secretary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as well. Thank you for being here.
Welcome. Thank you.
And to my far right is Qasim Rashid, who is the author of The Wrong Kind of Muslim, as well as his new book called Extremist. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get started. Help me define peace. What are the different types of peace that are out there? Wasim, what's out there?
You know, there are a lot of people who have, and there are a lot of dimensions to peace. My favorite, and this is really what I want to talk about, is I think peace has to do with alleviating human suffering. It has to do with serving people. It has to do with creating employment for the people who don't have, how they're going to put peace, bread on the table.
Is that economic peace?
Economic peace, social peace. You can talk about, justice, a lot of things. But I think deep down, I strongly feel that if we can make somebody happy, if we can find some job for a person who's my neighbor who is not working, if I can give sight to a person who's blind in Guatemala, I think I am contributing to peace. And these are those things: social, economic, health, education. That's a major part of trying to understand,
definition. How you help others in terms of achieving peace, what you can do for others. That's a great definition. Qasim, can you add to that? What are some other dimensions or elements of peace or definitions of peace?
Well, I think with peace, every conversation on peace has to inherently include a conversation on justice. Peace and justice are inseparable, and when you find a lack of justice in any situation, you find a lack of peace. And by establishing justice, you create the conditions for peace to exist. So, for example, look at some of the...
Before you go to justice, I want to really understand first, what are the elements of peace? So there's the economic peace that Wasim talked about. What are the other types of peace that are out there, and what are the dimensions of that?
Sure, a wide variety. There's a spiritual peace, being at one.
What is that about?
That's being at one with your purpose in life and why you feel you exist, what purpose you are here to serve. Being at peace with your creator or with your religion. There's also family peace. I think everyone out there probably has some parts of their family life that they aren't entirely happy with, and they want to establish that family peace. And then on a broader context, we get into international peace, which is, I think, the ultimate end result of not being able to satisfy your personal peace. It expands to societal peace, and then, it expands to a lack of societal peace, and then that expands to a lack of international peace.
Just talk to me, these are great elements. Talk to me about two more dimensions that I'd like to understand more about is around religious peace and political peace. How is that defined?
Well, those are the most important subjects of our day. When there are so many religions in the world, and there's a lot of conflict based on religious groups. So religious peace, or interreligious peace, you can say, is trying to find that, attain that goal where religions can coexist with one another without disorder, without conflict. Political peace has to do with states and their interactions with each other, and regional peace and international peace. You can talk about the United Nations, instruments that are trying to create, an order in the world. So that's really the political side of it.
Great definition. So now tell me who are some of the peacemakers out there? Well, let's start with Obama, Amjad. what is his context on peace, and how is he achieving it? He, just to give you some reference, he had a great speech in Egypt talking about how he should deal with the Muslim world. Tell us a little bit about that speech and perhaps some other context on what type of a leader is President Obama in terms of achieving the types of and the elements of peace that we've tried to discuss earlier.
Well, he's a very unusual and unique personality because he was anointed with the Nobel Peace Prize before he really had a chance to prove himself. So the world felt that when he was put into office, that itself, him being elected, was an act of peace because it brought races together, it brought nations together. But let's look at his record, because that's a more fair picture. He started off, I would contend, really focused squarely on building bridges between different nations and spiritual systems. He gave a keynote address to the Islamic world. He said that, you know, Muslims are part of the solution. That particularly he had this comment about the scientific legacy, this great legacy of knowledge, the golden age of Islam, and how the scientific budgets in the Islamic world need to be increased. He talked about Muslims, you know, he was a fig leaf to the Muslim world, and he had a lot of credibility because he was new and because he spent some time growing up in a Muslim country and because he had a Muslim father. And so his first task, I thought, was to build a bridge between Islam and the West, or between Islam and the United States. And that really was an act towards peace. But then you have to examine his record in terms of political peace and the way he has dealt with other nations. And he's trying to wrap up wars, but at the same time he's created a lot of disorder based on some of his policies, some would contend.
So let me give you a couple of quotes. One is the United States of America is prepared to use all elements of our power, including military force, to secure the core interests in regions. We will confront external aggression against our allies and partners as we did in the Gulf War. I mean, but it's a very aggressive form of peace. Is that just being strong, showing a stronger presence, or is this part of this narrative?
The President of the United States is also Commander-in-Chief. There's an inherent tension between Commander-in-Chief, engaging the military when you need to protect the security interest of a nation, and extending peace. Often those collide. And they have in his administration as they have in previous administrations. But there are certain elements of this. He's trying to wrap up. He has wrapped up 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Iraq war is wrapped up and the Afghan war is almost wrapped up. But in so doing, he's also engaged and authorized as Commander-in-Chief drone attacks on innocent civilians. And many innocent civilians have died at the hands of United States policy.
But he would argue it's not against innocent civilians, they're collateral damage.
Yes, he would argue that, and that's the inherent tension of a president of the United States. He has to, you know, tiptoe that line between having policies that promote peace, but also defending the security interest of the nation.
But he had this great promise of hope, Wasim. He had this promise of promoting democracy, human rights, open markets. Will what Amjad shared lead to that?
No, I don't think so. I think all of these are subject to the national interest, and this is unfortunately something we have to contend with and be realistic about. But I think not everything about Obama is negative. I think he did a great service to the people. I talked about healthcare. I mean, his Affordable Healthcare Act is, I think, probably one of the greatest achievements. You know, I mean, Clinton, he tried, he couldn't get through. Many other people tried to do something, but that is definitely leading to betterment of lives of millions of people in the United States. Then there is this thing that he's supposed to do. I don't know whether he will do it. Immigration reform. You know, we talk about peace as if it's only about guns and cannons and, you know, aircraft and whatnot. It's not. It's about all those opportunities that Latin America, Mexico in particular, sees just across the fence. And it builds up a lot of frustration, and there are a lot of people who are unhappy. And they're in the United States, millions of them, and for decades they have absolutely no hope to be able to ever see legitimacy of being. So he is promising to do something about it. I hope he does. So I think there are some positives.
So let's switch off country leaders, superpower leaders, and as we know, America spends more on its defense or military. It depends how you want to define it, and more than all other countries combined. I think you know what the number
800 million plus?
800 billion. Billion
yes,
plus.
Yes.
Let's switch to someone like Nelson Mandela. You know, early on he may not have been as pacifist, but he was he was a pacifist, organized rebellion. I mean, did he achieve the peace that we're talking about, the types of peace? Was he a leader that we can stand behind as well?
Well, I think he achieved some elements of peace. One of those notably being helping apartheid end in South Africa. And while I don't think I can agree with all of the methods used to get there, there's certainly much to be admired with his 27 years of solitude and imprisonment, and the long march to freedom, as it's so called. I had the unique opportunity to visit Robben Island and see his prison and see where he was kept in mental or physical shackles, however you want to define it. And it wasn't until I saw that I really admired what he went through to get to what he ultimately accomplished. And as a result of his sacrifices and as a result of his leadership, he helped create a new era for South Africans and really helped set a precedent around the world for us to recognize modern-day apartheid and combat against it. And I think that's one of his greatest contributions, in that he has so eloquently spoken out against apartheid in the modern construct, because it's not the same as the apartheid we saw 200-300 years ago with colonialism and imperialism. And it gives us a good schematic to know what to avoid in contemporary society. And so I think from that perspective, he's done a great service to humanity. And that level of peace is something we can get behind.
And while we can agree there's several other traditional and non-traditional peacemakers, so coming back to the religious context and the Muslim leader context, let's talk about the Khalifa of Islam, Mirza Masroor Ahmad. He's given countless speeches. He's written a book called World Crisis and the Pathway to Peace. He's done several speeches. But let's start with his speech in the U.S. What was the context of his speech in the U.S. at the Congress on the Hill?
So he spoke on June 27, 2012, so several years ago, and this was, obviously when you have a Muslim leader speaking about peace and justice, people pay attention, because unfortunately there are some Muslim elements that have perverted Islam to nefarious ends and have actually disrupted peace. So there's a leadership deficit in the Islamic world. So when a Muslim leader, which commands a following of tens of millions of people, comes to Capitol Hill and it was received with bipartisan support, his message is important. And what was that message? It was actually quite simple, that the path to peace must begin with justice. And there is no exception to the principle of justice. The pillars of governance in the Quran are amanat, trust, and adl, justice. And nations need to understand the importance of justice, even if you act against your own self-interest.
So what about powerful nations and less powerful nations? How should they act?
He talked about the disparity between wealthy nations and poor nations. There are responsibilities on both ends. The wealthy nations, because they've been blessed with resources, shouldn't exploit the weaker ones. The weaker ones shouldn't beg. They should understand that what they've received and make the most of their resources. So these are responsibilities that flow in both directions. But all of it stems from this notion that without justice, you can't really achieve the peace that applies to all of humanity, not just to America or the UK or Germany or the Eastern countries, but to all the world. That requires you to act against your own self-interest sometimes.
Wow. So I'm going to read a synthesis of his speech where the formula for true practical peace is absolute justice plus truthful testimony, minus glances cast enviously in the direction of wealth of others, minus developed nations using vested interest, plus developed nations helping and serving less developed selflessly, equals true peace. This is someone's analysis of his speech.
Absolutely.
How do you agree?
What Amjad was talking about, justice. Justice is not just some concept of a lawsuit between two people. It has to do with people, how they behave in situations which are likely to create disorder. So Islam's teachings, which His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad talked about, not only here, he also presented the same kind of ideas in the European Parliament. He presented them in the Parliament in England, in many other places, and he's written to all the leaders also. And what he's been saying is that you must not, even if you are, and this is what Islam teaches, even if you are being persecuted, even if people are dealing with you unjustly, your reaction should not be unjust. And this is
So
something
what is truthful testimony? What does that mean? What does absolute justice mean?
it means that when you are dealing with other nations, and he said it in the context of relations between nations, he said you got to deal justly. Just because you happen to have the power to be able to force somebody to sell you aluminum bauxite for a penny a pound, it doesn't mean you should send a warship and get it for that price. Just relations mean giving the other party the things that they need or merit on the basis of an evaluation, which everybody has on front of them when they're
Isn't
talking
that
to
against that nation's economic interest?
It certainly is, and this is, I'm coming back to what I said earlier. In political parlance, in political theory these days, self-interest is what determines the nation's route to take. And what His Holiness has been telling the world is that, look, if you keep doing this, in the long run, it's not in your interest because it will cause disorder in the world and peace will not be achievable.
So Qasim, another element of this is practical peace. Is it a pacifist, or is it something more than that? One of the quotes I have is, when a country seeks to control of another's resources unjustly, other nations should stop such cruelty with justice. How do they do that?
And I think this is where one of the biggest failings of the United Nations occur, because it doesn't have the teeth to really enforce its will. It has things like veto power, so the powerful nations can simply veto any resolution that they don't agree with or that goes against their
Did the
self-interest.
Khalifa talk to this? Then what did he say about the United Nations?
So, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my basic understanding is this, that as a result of the lack of justice in the United Nations, we're starting to see increasing conflicts over land disputes, over economic disputes. This is essentially what my colleagues just mentioned right now, that when you are focused on justice to establish peace, it requires the sacrifice of working against your own self-interest.
At times.
At times, not all times,
Not all
but in the short term, it will, with the promise that in the long term it will benefit. And the reason is very simple, that the only reason people work in their own self-interest is because they forget that we are all one humanity, we are all one community, we are one global village, and that what I do directly impacts you and vice versa.
But isn't the UN Security Council, when they use their veto power, isn't the purpose of that veto power to stop unjust actions? Wasn't that why it was created? So 8 nations can really go out and say, oops, if they see something really blaringly wrong, they can hold up a flag and say, stop this train.
That point is very important, what you just mentioned, because the Security Council consists of powerful nations.
Right.
There's an inherent problem with that. If the idea, and I agree with you, the intent of the UN is to prevent injustice, the composition of the Security Council should include all of humanity. It should include weaker nations as well. So there is not an overriding self-interest trigger that Russia can pull or China can pull or the US can pull. So right intentions, wrong execution, and we've seen the veto being exercised more to create unjust outcomes than to prevent them.
Look, if you look at climate, for example, climate.
Okay.
This is a real, when we talk about wars and all this has become, climate is something that belongs to all of humanity. So
Yes.
here we are talking about, and can a veto somehow or the other enable a country to just go on pumping carbon dioxide into the air and somehow or the other all the rest of the world will not be affected? It just doesn't make sense. We know the data, we know where the climate is going, and we all together have to apply justly our country's reactions in order to fix this thing.
So the powerful nations, how do they give up that control? If no matter what nation I belong to, I would want to be a part of the Security Council because it has lots and lots of power. So what do you suggest?
Transparency. This is what the Khalifa of Islam talks about. Transparency, making sure you actually do what you say. And if you are actually calling for, if you're the United States, let's take the United States, and if you're saying that you should treat prisoners justly, you should make sure people are tried, you should follow the rule of law, yet there's American exceptionalism, and you have things like Guantanamo Bay, you have drone attacks, you have US citizens being killed without trial, extrajudicial killings, rendition. Your policies don't track your pronouncements. You're not transparent. You're hypocritical. That creates an environment of injustice. And that is what the Khalifa of Islam is talking about, that powerful nations are uniquely situated. They've earned all of this power and authority. They have a larger responsibility to make sure they are transparent and they are practicing what they preach. And we don't see that, unfortunately, with some of the powerful nations.
So
Transparency is one. I would add awareness. If America realizes that we cannot continue to exist without fixing the environment, the climate, then they're more likely to take the actions that are necessary in order to fix things. Similar to what I'm just talking about climate because it's less emotional and it's something that we all can understand. But people have to be aware, and this is what His Holiness has also been doing. He has been going all across the globe telling people that, look, if we don't start acting justly, if we don't treat each other with dignity and respect, whether poor or rich nation, we will end up with a third world war and a nuclear holocaust.
So this Third World War, nuclear holocaust, I mean, he gave a speech in London at the 9th Annual Peace Symposium in 2012 around this, and he talked about justice and fairness, chapter 4, verse 136 of the Quran, but he really went down this path. This could be interpreted as scare tactics. Is there a danger of a nuclear war, a third world war, if we don't do the things that you guys have just talked about?
Look, there's a reason why World War I was originally called the war to end all wars. And eventually it was called World War I. Because after it, people thought, we can never go into a war again, we will never make that same mistake again. And within a generation, a much more horrific war occurred because of the same arrogance and unjust behaviors that led to the First World War. And now what we're seeing is, if you study world history and the types of economic disparities and the type of unjust behaviors that stronger nations are imposing on the weaker nations, we're finding a uncannily and frighteningly similar picture on the world landscape as we saw before World War I and World War II. And the frightening thing here really is the fact that now we have nuclear weapons. Albert Einstein was once asked what types of weapons will be used in World War III. He said, I don't know, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So the reality is that this dismissal, that this is just a scare tactic, is the exact problem, that's the exact cancer that will perpetuate this even further, because it won't allow us to see the dangers that we're getting involved in until and unless we recognize that we are human beings, we can make mistakes, we've made them twice before on an international scale. It can very well happen again, and the results will be far more devastating. Until we realize that, we risk engaging in something that's serious.
Thank you. And Amjad, I think you were at this event. The Key to Peace, Global Unity was a topic of the speech in the European Parliament in Brussels on 2012. Were you there?
Yes, I was.
So during that speech, taking out of the context of the political and countries, the Khalifa of Islam went into the family unit. What did he discuss there? Tranquility and harmony within family. How do you achieve that?
Well, see, this is why Islam is so beautiful, because the Islamic concept, and this is what the Khalifa of Islam is talking about, it begins with justice. But that is just the entry level to create peace. You have to have a base floor. When you have just relations between nations, that's the minimal responsibility, because you're basically treating others in a proper rule of law in a system where there's no exceptions to that. But then you have to have kindness. Absolute justice follows with kindness, which means you should treat others with a certain sense of sympathy for their plight, for what they're enduring, and you should give without the expectation that you will receive. But it goes beyond that. Then he says, absolute kindness, absolute justice, kindness, and kinship. You should love your fellow human being as if they're your own family. Yeah. That is the essence of Islam. So when he's talking about the family unit, we all know that my son and my father, I love them with all my heart. But do I also share that love with humanity? That is where you have to get to as a Muslim, and that's how you establish peace.
That is very deep. Is that actually attainable?
I think it's absolutely attainable because it starts from your home. The beauty of this profoundly difficult concept is that it's so simple to execute because it begins from your home. If you have that love for your own family, can that transcend to your next door neighbor? Can that transcend to those in your community, in your church, in your mosque, in your synagogues, in your temples? Can that transcend to your township, to your county, to your state, to the nation that you serve, to the international community? That is where it begins. So it's actually simple to execute from home. If you don't execute it in the individual capacity, in the family level, you won't have the unity that the Khalifa of Islam is talking about.
Can I add to that
Sure,
one more thing? When we were in the Capitol Hill, when Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad came there, Nancy Pelosi picked up on this point. She said, here's a man who has been imprisoned. You're talking about extending and everything, but you yourself, what have you done? And she picked up on this. Here's a man who was imprisoned, but he never retaliated. She said, here's a man who who heads an organization that has been persecuted for decades and a century and a quarter, but has never once retaliated. And so this is the person who can stand up and he can tell others, like, do this, and it will have beneficial effects.
Great. Wasim, let me follow up with that with a quote from one of his speeches in Brussels. Governments need to make policies that establish and protect mutual respect, through which hurting the sentiments of others or causing them any type of harm should be outlawed. And I think he goes on to talk about the mass immigration in Europe in particular, and Muslims coming, and how they live, and how do we achieve this?
We achieve it by recognizing that when somebody does the things that we say should be allowed to be done to others, we don't feel any pain, but when they are done to us, we feel that pain. All he's saying is that, look, common decency requires that if somebody holds another person in respect, you should not go out and, in front of him, malign that person. Or if people who are poor and don't have necessarily the clothing that you are enjoying, instead of mocking them and instead of disrespecting them and instead of treating them with humiliation, treat them with respect and honesty and honor that they merit as human beings, and you will improve the situation of peace. And it can be done. And again, as I said, it can be done by the person who himself is doing it.
So, Sir Qasim, shifting a little bit in what prevents us from doing this, and he talks about pride and arrogance, and there's this Quranic and sayings of the Prophet around this. But how does pride and arrogance play into this? Because this all sounds good, but how do I execute?
I'm a big believer in practical examples. Theories are great, but I want to see them work. And I look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad, because he dealt with these exact same issues, pride and arrogance, when trying to purge slavery from the Arabs, from the early Muslims. And one of the criticisms that people give of Prophet Muhammad is that he never stood up one day and said, free all your slaves. And he could have done that. He could have issued an executive order, just like Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation. But he didn't do that. Why? Because he knew that pride and arrogance don't just disappear just because you give an executive order. And so, going back to what Amjad pointed out earlier, he infused these attributes not just of justice, that all mankind is equal, asking people to recognize this. But then he asked people, his companions, to recognize that if you are going to keep slaves, you must treat them with kindness, and then you must treat them with kinship. So these Muslims realized themselves, like, wait, hold on a second. On one hand, he's my slave, and on the other hand, he's my son. I can't enslave my own son. And so people, their own arrogance, their own superiority complex was demolished by love of humanity, by kindness and kinship. And what we saw is within 2 decades of the advent of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, racial discrimination disappeared from a society entrenched in slavery for centuries prior. And even Christian historians and scholars admit that in the centuries afterwards, the people who were formerly slaves became great poets and generals and scholars and imams. They became the leaders of the Muslim world.
And there's a great quote here by the Prophet Muhammad: "The black person is not superior to a white person, nor is a white person superior to a black person," which
Absolutely.
I think led to what your contextual. You're going to
So, so that's equality, but I think that he hit it. It's love. You asked what and how can we overcome pride and arrogance and the fact that people have, it's love for your fellow man. And our fundamental statement in the religion, of course, is that this comes from having a true love and true relationship with the Creator who made all of us. And I think once we recognize that, love follows. But the short answer is love. It's having love for your...
So as members of the community, as followers of the Khalifa of Islam, and let's bring this very narrow to home of the United States of America, what is the Ahmadiyya Muslim community doing to achieve these outcomes? And in a 1-minute answer, so a little bit of a rapid fire, I'd love for you to discuss the political angle. I'd love for you to discuss the community outreach angle. I'd love for you to discuss the mass communication and media, and how do you, here's a great message. It sounds like a great message, a pathway to peace. I mean, who does not want peace? But then it sounds like such a extraordinary concept, and such an unattainable goal that some people would rather go work on something else instead, which is a lot easier. So what is the community, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, practicing what it preaches in this? And actually, we'll do 30 seconds in terms of tell me precisely a real example of something you're doing to attain this in the United States of America. I'll start with you.
Civic engagement, engaging at every level of government with our leaders and lawmakers, because it begins with your service to the country. We believe that if we are Ahmadi Muslims and we need to be the peacemakers of the world, we have to start in the home front, which means we need to engage our U.S. lawmakers not on political issues per se, but on issues that affect peace, that create disorder. So, things like hunger, for instance. We're on the Hill. Our youth association had 250 volunteers on the Hill in a walk for humanity, fighting for the right for all Americans to have basic subsistence.
And is the congressional leaders in America, how are they taking this?
They're taking it very well. We have bipartisan support. There were 30 lawmakers who received His Holiness, but we received an overwhelming response at all levels. So it is working, and just in a few years, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, there's the Ahmadiyya Muslim Caucus now in Congress, and these issues, we're actually seen as a resource on a lot of these issues that deal with peace.
That's great. What are you doing, in neighborhoods around the country? The Ahmadiyya Muslim community claims to be the largest Muslim organization, not only in the world, but in the U.S. that's organized under a
single leader, yes.
Single leader. So you have how many chapters do you have, and what are you doing across the country to attain this?
We have some 73 plus chapters in the United States and Marshall Islands now, and soon in Kiribati also. But I began because I sincerely believe peace begins with us, not with leadership of some political party or something. We are serving people. We are helping collect tens of thousands of pints of blood, help save.
So that's your Muslims for Life?
That's Muslims for Life. In the last 3 years, we've collected enough blood to help save 100,000 lives.
Wow.
In Guatemala, from here, we are sending doctors who are curing people. Who you want to see the face of the person, who gets eyesight. He's very happy, but there it turns out that we liberate another person who has always had to serve this other guy. You should see the smile on that person's face. So their young nephew or niece or grandson is liberated also at the same time as this person gets. So these are things that we're doing. In England, they just did a 600-mile drive, bicycle ride, to raise 100,000 pounds to help serve, improve the lives of people. So this is something that we're doing globally, not just in the United States.
So there's some practical examples. How are you communicating this? What are you doing to outreach and mass communication around this?
It goes back to writing the narrative of Islam that we want the world to see. Just a couple of hot-button statistics. Since 9/11 alone, our Muslim Writers Guild of America has published over 1,000 pieces in leading periodicals, Time Magazine, Economist, USA Today, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you name it, we've been there. Same with our media interviews, we've been at Fox, NBC, CNN, Al Jazeera. And the idea is to move past simply condemnation of extremism and move into engagement, into dialogue, into education. And you combine that with this level of compassion that we talked about, and you create a revolution of hearts and minds of people who are also like-minded and willing to engage in that conversation to establish peace and justice based on education.
The amazing thing is the American public has responded, and they're working with us.
Absolutely.
That is brilliant. That is great. Thank you all for being on the show. We discussed a topic that's seemingly unattainable. Now we have measurable and clear examples of how the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is doing this. I'd encourage all of yours to purchase the book, World Crisis and Pathway to Peace by the leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Khalifa of Islam, Mirza Masroor Ahmad. You can get it on Kindle, and you can buy it online at muslimsforpeace.org. Thank you once again for joining us from our studios at MTA USA in Silver Spring, Maryland.